It's a good thing to be a moderate, right? Right? But what if moderation by itself is not a good thing? What if maybe, just maybe, extremism is preferable to moderation, especially on big issues? Let's explore. Hello everyone, and welcome to the third episode of the Feel Good Mythology series. Barry Goldwater is routinely quoted as saying, "I would remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. And let me remind you also that moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue." This quote is sometimes used by collectivists as well to justify physical violence against property and other individuals, or to justify radical policies that fly in the face of common sense, property rights, and usually basic dignity. I've recently seen a lefty using this quote as a justification for the aggressive pursuit of the LGBTist agenda, for instance. And we'll talk more about that towards the end of this week when we'll tackle left-wing tolerance. But until then, it is worth noting that this quote is, well, incomplete. Barry Goldwater, in the exact same acceptance speech, has clarified exactly what he meant. Let me read you the portion that is routinely left out whenever this quote is being brought up. "Those who seek absolute power, even though they seek it to do what they regard as good, are simply demanding the right to enforce their own version of heaven on earth. And let me remind you, they are the very ones who always create the most hellish tyrannies. Absolute power does corrupt, and those who seek it must be suspect and must be opposed. Their mistaken course stems from false notions of equality, ladies and gentlemen. Equality, rightly understood as our founding fathers understood it, leads to liberty and to the emancipation of creative differences. Wrongly understood, as it has been so tragically in our time, it leads first to conformity and then to despotism." It is no wonder that most people leave this part out, isn't it? For if they'd include it, most of the times they'd have to drop the Goldwater reference altogether, since this quote is routinely used precisely to promote the version of equality that brings in conformism and despotism. Those who propose various types of heaven on earth ideologies, such as Marxists, environmentalists, feminists, fascists, and so on and so forth, the proponents of these ideas almost invariably tend to think that they have the moderate solution between what they perceive to be, or what they presume to be anarchy or state of nature, and the full-blown controlled environment. You don't have to believe me on this. Just ask any of these people about how their ideal heaven on earth looks like. Most of them would sound moderate, and the real ideologues, when they try to sell their ideas, are quite open in asking loaded questions like, "What's wrong in enforcing a 50-50 sex quota in companies? Equality is good, isn't it?" Or, "What's wrong in having a slightly lower standard of living so we can hug more trees? Trees are wonderful, don't you agree?" Or, "What's wrong in paying slightly more in tax so your neighbor can also eat as good as you?" The problem with all of these is that they invariably end really bad, because the only way to enforce them is through coercion, which, as Goldwater put it, ends in a hellish tyranny. History is full of examples where extremism was preferable to moderation. For instance, in the eastern part of my country, or the former kingdom, namely Moldova and Wallachia, when the abolition of slavery was being debated in late 1840s, there were three positions. The two extremist positions, one by the state, which wanted to keep it going, and one by the liberal thinkers educated in France who wanted it abolished without further delay. And then there was the third position, the moderate position, the church, who essentially agreed that generalized slavery is a bad thing, but also believed that under certain circumstances, slavery is preferable to freedom. Now, the extremist classical liberals won, and in 1855-56 slavery was abolished after it had previously been abolished in Transylvania as early as 1786. It's more complicated than that, but basically, the moderates were wrong, and wrong by a wide margin. Similar thing happened in the United States, where the Democrats wanted slavery to continue and the Whigs were willing to make some moderate concessions. So a group of radical extremists emerged who did not want to hear about any concessions but wanted to end the practice altogether. Those radical extremists are now known as, well, the Republican Party. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. Anyway, let's take a more recent example, the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. Now, in all former Eastern Bloc countries, there were three positions basically in 1989. One was, well, keep the Soviet-like system, the second one was abolish it in its entirety, and the third way moderates, who insisted that there are things fundamentally good with the existing system. Now, sadly for my own country, the moderates won, at least at first. And it shows, especially when compared to Poland, where the extremists won and Leszek Balcerowicz got to cut right through the economic madness of socialism. The long-term results prove him right and the moderates wrong. Now, whenever one makes such arguments, the usual retort is to find certain instances within the moments described to show that not everything went right. For instance, the abolition of slavery also resulted in certain deaths of starvation, and in the case of the United States this was particularly bad, because unlike Europe, the US had a shorter transition period, and also certain post-slavery policy mistakes have been made. But while all of that is true, one has to also remember that there are no solutions, but merely trade-offs. I know it sounds cynical, but that's how reality works, at least on this planet. Perfect, simply does not exist. There's only various degrees of better and worse. And in many cases, particularly on big issues, it is preferable to cut the evil right from its root, even if that means short-term pain. In fact, this is generally the conservative view, or the tragic vision, as Thomas Sowell would put it, the emphasis on delayed gratification. Let's not have the paradise on earth now, because too many people will die. Let's do it gradually. Let's see what works. Let's test it. Now, sadly, it will take decades until our philosophical opponents will at least understand that. Now, I'm not naive nor arrogant enough to think that our philosophical opponents will end up agreeing, but at the moment, most of the so-called moderates don't even understand where the argument opposing them even comes from. Basically, we've had such a long period of this path that moderation is somehow fundamentally good that we've forgotten that it's the extremists, the radicals, the vanguards that push civilization one way or the other, not the moderates. The moderates just end up eventually following. I guess the shortest way to summarize this video would be like this. In most cases, moderation means the compromise between poison and non-poison. Such a compromise is still a poisoned solution, which is why it is to be avoided. And with that being said, thank you for watching and for your continuous support of this channel. I'll see you around on Freedom Alternative.